And welcome. Today we're going to talk about virtualization and specifically virtualization for your business. Not exactly probably one of the most entertaining subjects that we've had here at Next Tech University, but definitely a buzzword in the industry, and we want to have all the details around that so you can kind of understand what it's all about. You know, this really was introduced to me probably around 10 years ago at some point, and I remember a story when we were out to visit a small business customer, and they had 5 employees and 7 servers in the back room. And I remember I went in there with some of our technical team, and as we took a look in the back, I remember thinking, how can they have more servers in the back room than they do employees? In fact, the reality of it was the bill to support those servers from a standpoint of power and cooling and all that was more than the rest of the bill for the entire business. So obviously things were out of line, and then one of the technical guys with me said, hey, we got to look at virtualizing this environment so that we can reduce costs, make everybody more productive, and ultimately help bring this server farm, if you will, under control, and we really replace it down to 1 server. So let's get into some of the details of what virtualization is today, and from a standpoint of, what are the basics. And if you think about it, over the last decade, hardware has continued to increase in performance, and we see that RAM and hard drive space and all these things have outpaced the software's needs of that server. So what we had was a bunch of servers out there that were running like in the business that we talked about, where really they ran at about 2 to 5% utilization most of the time. Sure, there were some peaks up there that kind of went up from a standpoint of the processing and things, but most of the time the hardware was really underutilized. And so then what we had was every time that you needed to add an application, or you just added another server, which servers are kind of expensive. They've come down recently, but really they're somewhere between $2,500 to probably $5,000 a piece on the minimum side, and definitely go up from there. So that's where we can kind of introduce something called a VM, V period M period. That's a virtual machine. And if you think about it, there are machines running, multiple machines, virtual machines running inside of one piece of physical hardware. And understanding that most of the applications are running, or these virtual machines aren't using much more than 5% of the resources at any given time, well then what we can do is put these virtual environments inside of the physical piece of hardware so that we get better utilization of that hardware. So if you had say 10 applications running at 5%, then you could still be under, at 50% of the hardware utilization, and really just run it on one piece of physical equipment. So what are the benefits of doing that? Number one is power, right? You're not running 6 machines, you're running 1. Secondly, being redundancy. Instead of buying 6 machines where you had to put all the RAID pools and different things for redundancy, you can just have one single set of hard drives that you can have in a better configuration for more redundancy. And instead of buying 6 physical pieces of equipment, you're just buying 1. You can put more processing in it because, essentially, and again, instead of buying 6 processors, you might buy 1 or 2. And then what happens is inside of these virtual machines is we can give minimum allocations. So what do I really mean by that? That means that let's just say that we wanted to give 10% of the processing power to each application, which again, that would give only 60% in this case. I can give 1/6 of the storage space to each one of the virtual machines, but then I can oversubscribe. So for example, let's just say most of our applications are only using up to 5%, but on Friday it's running payroll. Well, payroll is a very number intensive, very processor intensive process on that application. So all of a sudden it can use all of the processor power available to it, all of the RAM available to it, without hindering the other application's performance. So really what you end up having is better overall performance, and it gets done faster on your payroll using the same amount of resources that you've already purchased. So things are working better at a lower cost. In addition to that, when you start looking at how a virtual machine works, imagine in your head that that virtual machine is a full operating system, It's a full, all those applications you run like antivirus, all those things are running inside of that. The application itself doesn't really understand it's virtualized. It doesn't understand that it's not physically on its own piece of separate hardware. So as far as it knows, life's still good and everything's separated. But the real benefit becomes is, let's just say that for some reason our hardware failed. I can take that virtual environment, pull it up on a new machine, and because it's virtual, all those drivers that we used to have to deal with, like video drivers and motherboard drivers and all that stuff, we've separated that hardware layer from the software layer. So things can spin up on a separate piece of hardware, irregardless of the specifications, and we can be up and running in a matter of minutes instead of what used to take days. Because if you think about it, I used to have to order a particular piece of hardware. I had to install the operating system. I had to install the drivers. I had to install the antivirus. I had to install the applications. I had to run the updates. Then I had to recover the backup. Now I can just take my virtual image that I have as a backup, run it on a new piece of hardware, and really it's not dependent on the hardware piece, and so therefore it spins up faster and works better at that layer. So some of the things that you probably ought to know relevant to that environment and virtualization. So let's change subjects a little bit. There's kind of two major players in this market. There's Microsoft that has Hyper-V. You'll find in this environment we like to use the word hyper for whatever reason. The other one is VMware. That's a brand that's out there. And really both of these applications have a free version. There's some limitations to the free version, and really where the special sauce is, and I don't want to limit it to only, but the special sauce is in the hypervisor. Again, another hyper word, but that's the software layer that looks at all these virtual machines and controls that allocation of resources. So as I gain, say more than 3 virtual servers, maybe I want to have more control of that hypervisor, and then I might have to buy the paid version of these applications to get better control. Or maybe I want to run a redundant server so that they run in kind of pairs, and so if this piece of hardware fails, it can fail over to the second piece of hardware. That would be more in the paid version, but they can control all of that, so we limit the downtime. So that kind of gives us the key identifiers there. The next question that I'm asked a lot is, do I need to virtualize, and what things should I be looking at to virtualize? First of all, you probably ought to have a minimum of 3 servers that are out there. You're not going to see any real benefit of virtualizing until you probably have a minimum of 3 applications running on a server. Now understand, maybe you have 2 applications running on one server today. You could, and then a separate server, you could kind of tie those together, and that would equal your 3 applications. So what are the benefits of doing that? Well, when you're running, different applications all in the same server, if there's a problem with that server, say the operating system or the application's crashed, you have to reboot that whole environment, which then you have downtime for all applications on that server. In a virtualized server, you're rebooting still, but it's not rebooting at the hardware layer, it's only rebooting at that virtual layer, so only that particular application that's on that server is rebooting, not all the virtual environment applications. So better uptime, better control, and really better use of resources. The next thing you need to be aware of is if you have anything that requires physical ports. So for example, we had a business that had one of the digital signs out front with the images that displayed across them, and it connected to a computer via a serial port or a USB port. Well, because that virtual environment separates the software layer from the hardware layer, there can be issues relevant to that. So know if you have any of those kind of ports that require, some kind of direct connection, you just need to be aware of it. Doesn't mean that you can't do it, but it could be a potential issue. Applications are recommended to support virtualization. That doesn't mean that they have to. So for example, some of the things that we find frequently is a business will have an old application that they've retired, but they want to have access to that data, maybe to pull up a customer's account from a past application, things like that. It's perfect for a virtual environment. Don't use it a lot, don't want to pay a lot of money to keep it running, but really we can just put it in a virtual environment, keep it in its own encapsulated little control center, And that way I have access to it when I need it, but I don't have this piece of physical equipment running in the back room that's getting older, that hard drives can start crashing. It's running on newer equipment to keep us up and running. And so I wanted to end with kind of the 5 things that you need to know if virtualization is right for you. So number 1, most likely you're going to have to purchase new hardware. So if you've purchased new hardware and you didn't do the virtualization up front, you're probably going to have a problem. Not guaranteed, but if you have the expectation you're going to take older hardware and run virtualization on there, probably not a good plan. Not a good plan from a couple standpoints. Number 1 is the labor that it requires to make this happen. It's a good time to do it when you're setting up a new server, but just to virtualize for that fact, if you've already got it set up, can be painful. So just understand that. Number 2 is the server needs to be configured for virtualization. So if you've bought a piece of equipment and you didn't configure that way, it may not be compatible. Probably anything bought in the last couple of years is. But then the next question is, if you're going to run 5 virtual machines inside of there, you may want a more beefy piece of hardware to run it than maybe you did for that one application. So making sure that you kind of make a purchasing decision around this virtual environment, not just kind of last minute decide, oh, I got this equipment, now I'm going to try it. For a test market, that might work fine, but for overall, you probably want to make this at the time when your servers become time to replace. So when do we recommend you replace a server? Probably every 5 to 7 years at longest, when your warranty starts expiring, but we see a higher rate of failure on spindle hard drives, those kind of things. So we recommend you keep that under kind of maintenance and keep it up to speed. So 5 years is probably a good number on there. The second thing that you need to be aware of is what's your recovery strategy. You know, hardware still does fail even if you have it in a redundant environment. So you might want to make sure that you understand what's your backup plan. Some people, it's as simple as you can virtualize it and run it on a laptop. Now understand, you went from a server environment to a laptop. It's going to run slow, but will it run? Can you maybe service your customers? Absolutely. So making sure that you understand, is that acceptable for your business, or do you want a piece of fully redundant kind of backup application running on some kind of a small server so it can run on that server if the main server fails? Or do you want to have a cloud strategy where you can just purely recover in the cloud, run off the cloud? That way, if your physical environment's been damaged, fire, flood, those kind of things, you can just recover in the cloud. And as long as you have an internet connection, you're up and going. Number 3 is licensing. So it might seem simple. If I've got one box, I need one operating system. That's not really true. So if you're running 5 virtual machines, you need to license 5 operating systems, which can be expensive. So knowing that just because you've put them in a virtual environment, all the licensing charges apply, and a lot of times, like Microsoft, they have virtual operating system licenses. They are a little bit lower cost typically, but still very expensive from a standpoint that an operating system is expensive. Antivirus needs to be licensed that way. Backups need to be licensed that way, and they all need to be compatible with a virtual environment. So think about some of those expenses when you're building this. Number 4, rebooting, patching, all those things. We kind of talked about that you're rebooting in a virtual environment, but understand that when you patch the servers, you got to patch all 5 of them still. Now you can do them logically, so if you're running all the same operating system, you can have that hypervisor deploy some of that stuff. Just be aware about thinking these things when you're kind of running it in that environment. And then number 5 that I have is virtual servers. If you're building hardware and you've got 3 applications running today, say, and 3 virtual machines, maybe what you're going to do is, in a year I might be looking to change applications. Build that hardware to support it for the future, because again, if we're going to expect that hardware to last 5 years, we may want to oversize it for input, output, maybe put some solid state drives in there for the controllers, those kind of things, so we get better performance. And again, since you're only buying one piece of physical equipment, you might want to oversize it a little bit more because you're not having to buy as much. So build it to support additional machines, build it to support additional scale. And really what I was hoping today is, I hope I've given you a picture of what virtualization is. I know it was pretty simple, it was pretty down to earth, but if you have any questions, you can give us a call here at Nextech or shout us out on social media, and we'll be glad to answer any of the questions that you have and show you the value of how virtualization can help your business today.